Former Inspector General of the United States Department of Transportation, Mary Schiavo, has been involved in some of the world's biggest air crash investigations. As an aviation lawyer, Schiavo represented families of passengers and crew who died in the 9/11 attacks, as well as a fatal Air France plane crash in 2009 that killed 228. I spoke to Mary Schiavo earlier in New York. Mary Schiavo, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
There are dozens of ships and planes now scouring the South China Sea for the missing aircraft. What will the debris tell us when they find it?
On the debris, for example, on TW800, which exploded off the coast of New York, the debris had a characteristic pattern, and from that they could tell that there was an explosion. There's a pitting pattern, and if there's something pattern like that, they will know there was an explosion. If there isn't, they will also know that the plane had a breakup without any some kind of an explosion. So even the pieces, even without the black boxes, even without recordings, will yield a terrific amount of evidence, but they've got to pick them up and get them on board so they could be analyzed.
How long does the black box continue to give off signals under the water?
About 30 days. The battery is good for 30 days, sometimes longer, sometimes less, but depending on the condition. But those boxes are amazingly strong. In the 4 planes that were intentionally crashed on September 11, 2001 in the United States by terrorists, the 2 into the World Trade Center did not survive because of the intense heat. But the data recorder from the Pentagon crash and the data and voice recorder from the Shanksville plane did survive. So even in intense heat they did, and they survived Air France 447, and that was in the water for months, for a very long period of time. They survived. Not the battery, but the black boxes and the recordings.
What do we know already about the plane's last minutes in the air?
Well, unfortunately, not a lot. This is a great plane. The 777 is very much like the Airbus 340 in that the plane itself gives off information, and they're called system status checks. And the plane sends this information back to the airline's base all the time. It's kind of like the plane taking its own temperature. But here, at least according to reports so far, there was no information. And that's very odd because this is a very sophisticated plane and it has triple redundancies. It doesn't have just one radio or 2. It doesn't have one set of wiring. It has lots of redundancies. So whatever made it impossible to transmit was a pretty significant event, because otherwise there would be transmissions, and of course there was no, at least according to what we've heard so far, no Mayday call. And it doesn't have to be a radio call. There are transponder codes that you can, they call it squawking, transponder codes, and you can also put it in through a computer system called an ACARS.
When you say that suggests a significant event, does that tend to suggest a mid-air explosion, a bomb, for example?
Well, it doesn't have to be an explosion. For example, Air France 447 was a horrific event, but in that case what happened is the airspeed was deteriorating. They had encountered significant weather, and then at some point the airflow over the wings was insignificant. It wasn't enough to keep the plane flying, and that's called a stall. And the plane literally then falls to the ground. It's almost like a leaf. I worked a case on that at West Caribbean Airlines, and it crashed in the jungles of Venezuela. The same thing happened. It encountered some bad weather, icing event. The pilots didn't monitor the airspeed, and it crashed into the jungle. Obviously there was no time to get a mayday, but it wasn't an explosion. The plane literally just fell out of the sky.
There was a report that the plane made a sharp right turn and dropped suddenly before it went off the radar. What does that tell you?
To me, that suggests a stall. When an airplane stalls, and that doesn't mean you lose your engines, it means you're losing your airflow over your wings, sufficient speed to keep the plane in the air. What happens is the plane noses up, and it goes up like this, and then it kind of shakes, and then it falls off, and it would lose altitude really dramatically, and that's what happens in a stall. You can recover from them, but you have to be on top of your instruments and flying very carefully. Air France 447, for example, stalled.
On the passports now, how is it possible that 2 passengers were able to check in at Kuala Lumpur Airport with stolen passports?
Well, the question is why they weren't flagged, because one was in the national indices as a stolen passport, so that should have been flagged if people were checking. But obviously things fall by the wayside. Some people, you know, as in accidents in the past, as in September 11, 2001 in the United States, security, the stated security was not the security that we had.
Interpol have said that only a handful of countries around the world routinely make checks on passports. I think that's come as a bit of a shock to the public.
Yes, absolutely. And particularly where the plane was headed, Beijing is pretty tight on passport control. But if Malaysia Air wasn't, then they would have had to, I mean, say the flight went on and landed safely, then, you know, the passport control officers in Beijing would have had to deal with the problem. But that being said, stolen passports and fake passports are not nearly as rare as people would like to think. For example, an Air India plane crashed back in 2010. There were 158 people on board, and there were 10 to 13, the count is still unclear, 10 to 13 fake passports or stolen passports out of 158 passengers. So it's not rare.
Just to conclude, with the information as patchy as it is now, what do you think happened?
In terms of losing all data, having no Mayday calls, having no transmissions from the aircraft itself, and just falling from the radar, I would at this point say that what happened is they had a stall and lost control and went into the ocean, unless there's any explosive pattern on the wreckage, and then I would tend to think that it was a bomb or an explosion of a fuel tank. I would guess a bomb rather than a fuel tank explosion, because the fuel tank explosions have happened when it's very, very hot.
Mary Schiavo, thank you very much for joining the programme.
Thank you. My pleasure.